for people who are looking around at the world and are slightly baffled by some of these rather large-scale, often quite violent trends that they're seeing in society around them, and they're trying to make sense of it. And I'll give you one example, and of course it's the big example from this year, is the BLM movement, which began, of course, with the killing of George Floyd. And it's been this strange process of going from what everyone, I think unanimously across the ideological spectrum, perceived as utterly unacceptable, to a movement that is now saying our goal is to dissolve the traditional family and to overthrow capitalism. And I think for a lot of people looking on, you can understand the legitimate genesis of a movement like that while being utterly baffled with where it's going. So I ask the question, is there anything behind this? Can it be tracked backwards to something that animates all of these movements? And if so, what's going on in the larger picture? And that's really what I'm after. Yes. Yeah. And in fact, David, some of the lighter moments in the book look at exactly that kind of dynamic that says, are we even permitted to have a sense of humor these days? Not included in the book, but one that caught my attention, a famous comedian from the UK, John Cleese, who of course was the creator of the Monty Python series, known around the world. He picked up on this idea that the what we might call the woke police were saying that a certain episode of Fawlty Towers had to be cancelled and removed and deplatformed and all of these new words that we're all trying to come to terms with, because there was a reference to Hitler. Now, what he points out is that the reference to Hitler was no endorsement. In fact, it was the exact opposite. It was an ironic mocking of the topic. And he makes the point that we've become awfully brittle when we can't even tell if humor is mocking something evil. And we then sort of shy away from that. And it's just a very interesting issue when we are policing our own thoughts to such a great extent. Now, I think very key to this entire book is just the origin of the phrase political correctness. It turns out we think it's something relatively new. Academics have traced the first usage of this phrase to the year 1921 and to Soviet Russia. It was actively introduced into the Soviet, the Russian and communist population as a means of policing opinions. Now, that's quite an interesting idea, because when you think to yourself, if you are a tyranny and you need to control a great number of people, you cannot possibly control every individual one by one. So what an ingenious move to teach people to do it interpersonally. And that was the first usage of this phrase, it is politically correct, it is not politically correct. It comes straight out of Soviet Russia. Now, today we think of it as something that is, in a sense, very enlightened. And few people are actually aware that that is where the concept originates. Now, again, by stark contrast to that, my personal take is that freedom flourishes where debate is free and open, no sacred cows, and anything may be discussed. To counter that, in the varsities today, we're seeing this taught idea of a sort of fragility culture that says, if you in any way debate any of my sacred cows or discuss issues that we are not allowed to discuss, it is held to be the same thing as violence or as genocide or as any of these sort of scope creep ideas where a debate is conflated with genocide. And that is a fascinating new development. It's one, in fact, I actually quote research by Jonathan Haidt, a psychologist who wrote a book, The Coddling of the American Mind. And he makes the point that from, he goes back to something like 1104 up until 2016, the whole idea of a university was to challenge young people to face new ideas. In 2016, something traceably, measurably changed. And it became the genesis of this idea of safe spaces, of people not being allowed to discuss ideas. And I find that very problematic. Yeah. So I wasn't aware of that letter, but that is an issue that I actually do touch on the book. And it's such an interesting one because you have to write about it so cautiously and with such great care. Because the idea of a rape culture... Now, David, I live in a country that has one of the highest rape rates on the planet. Some of our estimates and some of our surveys have put rape rates for women in South Africa at 1 in 3 and some at 1 in 2. Now, of course, you can never be 100% certain of the veracity or the accuracy of stats like that. But that is something that we might look at and say, there you have something that can genuinely be called a rape culture. The phrase, however, or the term, does not come to us from South Africa. It is commonly used in the United States, and it is typically applied in varsities. And in writing about this, as I say, I have to be very cautious to say any rape is obviously morally and legally unacceptable. However, the actual rape statistics are not what is reported. So there was an estimate that was part of the sort of popular narrative that was something like 1 in 10, I think it was, young women going to varsity. And then I compare that with the FBI stats that say it's off by an order of magnitude. And that is very much the kind of topic matter that I cover, because when you accuse an entire group of people wholesale of a crime, that is an exceptionally serious thing to do. You are, in one sense, harming an entire demographic that cannot defend itself because there is no specific charge against each individual. And in another sense, where each individual is accused of something, as you rightly point out, there is less recourse to due process, and that is extremely concerning. I think that's a very fair point, yes, absolutely. And I mentioned that the heart and soul of it is sort of what we might call collectivism versus individual liberty. And if I might sort of take two different examples here, the birth of sort of collectivist philosophy would really be the French Revolution. And that was very much a sort of a violent upheaval and overthrowing of the old order. And in its wake, for starters, we saw a great deal of violence. There was a reign of terror immediately after that, following which we saw the very first instances of what you might call the seeds of political correctness, which were, if you don't think correctly, you're heading to the guillotine. Now, that was a very strange and a very new idea. Across the pond from that, you've got the UK, which has been traditionally a relatively stable country over the centuries. It's had its upheavals and it's had its revolutions, but by and large it differed from France in a couple of very interesting ways. France tried to impose what we might call politically correct values from the top down, and it was done very much by force. Whereas in the UK, there was very little in the way of a vision for the people. In fact, in stark contrast to France, what happened in the United Kingdom was the slow progression of common law. Common law was not given to the people by a tyrant. Famously, their Magna Carta limited the powers of the king, and that was quite a big step forward in Western society. And after that, common law became this case of just normal human beings negotiating what life was going to be like and building up what effectively became the infrastructure of their communities. And they were a good example of what we might call individual liberty as contrasted against a social vision imposed on people. And that's much of the heart and soul of what we're looking at today. The founding of your own nation, of course, was the next step, one could argue, after the British system, which was uniquely predicated on the idea that laws and rights and so forth do not come from a king or from a tyrant. It started with the idea that all men are created equal, that they have this sort of inviolable relationship with nature or with God, however you perceive it, and then you may build a nation around that. Now we can get into what the United States is today, but that was the founding idea, and it was an exceptionally good idea for my money. So the whole book then takes this contrast between collectivist systems that try to impose a vision versus the idea of the freedom and inviolability of an individual. And that's the foundation. From there we go exploring and we look at social justice trends and fads and so forth, and we compare them. I would like to see zero social engineering. I think the biggest problem is well summed up by a gentleman named William Easterly. He's got a book by the title The Tyranny of Experts. And the name is a little misleading. It sounds like he's picking on all experts. He's actually not. He's talking about people who work in economic development in African nations. And he was involved in economic planning for various African nations for some 40, 50 years. And after all of this, his take is, it doesn't work. The worst thing you can do for human prosperity, both economic and in terms of our general health, is to have a top-down vision by a strong leader. And my take is that that's exactly what goes wrong here. You can't impose visions on other people. The better alternative is inviolable individual freedom. where in essence there is no big social plan for the nation or for the community because you're free. You are not thought policed. You are not told what you may or may not say. You are not given moral prescriptions for what you are supposed to believe. And above all, you don't have a tyrant in power telling you what the vision is for the nation. The best case outcome is human freedom, individual liberty, under a government that simply upholds the law and then in essence gets out of the way. In many ways, that's a very simple thing to want. But I think when we sort of look back down the corridors of human history, it is exceptionally rare. Yeah, absolutely. And of course, the big problem here is tyrants disguised as people doing kind things. And Dr. Thomas Sowell, an economic historian from the US, is exceptionally good at debunking these things. He essentially says the problem is a politician will stand up on a stage and talk about something that sounds so kind and it's so helpful. And he says the problem is we buy these social programs based on the intended outcome, not the actual outcome. And what he then does is he tracks several instances of these things through the decades and through different nations, and in most cases points out if they'd done nothing, it would have been much better. Uphold the law and get out of the way. These big kind narratives that we sell that then become social programs and social engineering, by and large, tend to do more harm than good. Very, very simple but very clear example of that one. The poverty rate among Black Americans in the United States last century was on a sharp decline. It was, in other words, prosperity was rising to a great degree, right up until the Johnson administration declared war on poverty, at which point it stopped. And that's just one example of this sort of, when you start to tinker and do social engineering, how it actually stops what was good progress. It stops things that would happen absent the intervention of government programs. And of course, again, the problem there, sold as kindness.